Morning, everyone. Today, I want to talk about our country. So let me begin with this. By the show of hands, how many of you are convinced that Indonesia will become a developed country by 2045? No? Okay, that's good. That's good. Now, please keep your hands up if you think we are on the right path to get there. No? All right. So, to guide our thought process today, I want to introduce this framework that we can use. First, let's start with where we are. Then we will continue examining where we want to be. And we'll talk about how to get there. Now, before we start, I want to ask all of us, what do you think are the characteristics that define a developed country? Some of you might point out strong economy. Some of you might point out high living standard. Some of you might think of stable political landscape and strong institutions. So let's take a look at how other developed countries in the world have fared. In terms of economy, developed countries have seen soaring GDP in the past decades. In terms of living standards, exemplified by life expectancy, most developed countries have high living standards, in this sense, high life expectancy. In terms of political landscape, most developed countries have low corruption rate. This would signal predictability, stability in the political landscape of that country, both for its citizens and also for foreigners. Now, as promised, I want to talk about where we want to be. We've been hearing three things. Number one, Indonesia wants to become a developed country by 2045. And in order to do that, Indonesia would need to achieve an 8% economic growth, and in parallel, we would need to reach 0% poverty. So let's take a look at the first one, 8% economic growth. In the past 10 years, not accounting for the economic growth during the COVID period, Indonesia has achieved a stable economic growth at around 5%. Comparing that to other developing countries, Indonesia is faring pretty well. Indonesia has seen a skyrocketing GDP in the past few decades. And comparing that to other developing countries, Indonesia is on the right track to continuously grow. Now let's talk about the second metric here, which is the 0% poverty. So since the 1980s, 1970s, Indonesia has been able to slash poverty rate all the way from above 70%, all the way to just about 1.82% recently. And that is a remarkable achievement. Even comparing this figure with the figure of other developing countries, Indonesia is doing pretty well. Now, let's talk about the third one here. 2045, our status as a developed country. The transition team from the previous government to the current government has identified 4 levers for Indonesia to be able to become a developed country. Number 1, high-skilled talent. Number 2, high global supply chain integration. Number 3, high technology. And number 4, large capital. Let's break it down one by one, and let's start with the first one. High-skilled talent. So according to Global Talent Competitiveness Index, though Indonesia has some homework to do to catch up with developed countries, Indonesia is doing pretty well in comparison to other developing countries. The ranking of Indonesian top universities have skyrocketed in the past few years, even though Indonesia has some catch-up to do, not only with countries globally, but also with universities in Asia. In parallel of that, we've seen that the number of Indonesians studying abroad for tertiary education has gone up in the past few years, and this illustrates that there's more and more Indonesians having access to high-quality education abroad, attaining skills and knowledge from overseas, and they can bring it back to Indonesia to build our country at some point. In parallel of this, we've seen that the government has rolled out a policy to allow foreign universities to operate in Indonesia, which would mean more universities from overseas will be able to provide access to education to everyday Indonesians. Now, in the past few months, the government has been mulling over the idea of allowing dual citizenship. While this is not confirmed yet, but this potential policy would mean a couple of things. Number one, it will attract foreigners to have Indonesian citizenship. Number two, it will retain Indonesian talents, diaspora, either studying or working abroad. And number three, in turn, this will prevent Indonesia from experiencing a brain drain. Now let's talk about the second lever here, which is high globalized supply chain integration. In the past few years, we've seen that trade in Indonesia, in terms of both export and import, has been going up. It means that Indonesia is becoming more and more integrated to the global supply chain. In parallel of this, in the past few months, we've heard that the government has formally applied to become a member of the OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And this is a club of advanced economies in the world. In parallel of this, the government has also announced Indonesia applying to become a member of CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement on Trans-Pacific Partnership. What would joining these two frameworks do to Indonesia? Number one, it will increase trade access to Indonesia. We'll have more trade destinations with low trade barriers, but also at the same time, it will catapult Indonesia to be able to meet global standards, push for domestic reform, and in turn will make Indonesia more competitive globally. As recent as last week, we heard that Indonesia finally sought membership at BRICS. What would this mean is that Indonesia is not only seeking more access to advanced, developed economies, but we're also looking for access to other developing countries in the world. This would expand our trade access globally. Now let's talk about the third lever, which is high technology. According to the Global Innovation Index, Indonesia, while we have some catch-up to do, but actually we're doing pretty well in terms of innovation. We're even more innovative compared to rich country like Brunei. Now, the fourth lever, large capital. When we talk about large capital, one thing comes to mind: foreign direct investment. And when we look at the inflow of FDI to Indonesia, we're one of the most competitive in the region. And we're faring better than some neighbors in ASEAN. Now, this year, we've heard that the government has rolled out the Golden Visa policy, which would allow foreigners to come to Indonesia to do business, set up their company, increase mobility to and from Indonesia. The first person ever to receive this Golden Visa is the CEO of ChatGPT, the CEO of OpenAI, Sam Altman. In parallel of this, we've seen that the CEO of global tech giants like Apple, Microsoft, and Nvidia has either visited Indonesia or has pledged a sum of money to invest in Indonesia to develop its AI and cloud infrastructure, among others. So we've been talking about how optimistic the outlook for our country is. Seems all like a good news. But there is a big caveat. Indonesia becoming a developed country is not and is never guaranteed. We have a pressing challenge. One crisis that we face today is the climate crisis. And this climate crisis poses an existential threat to our country's quest to be a developed country. Let's take a look at some of the examples on how the climate crisis posed an existential threat. Let's take a look at some of the examples from island countries like Tuvalu and Kiribati. These countries are threatened by the rising sea level, and these countries could potentially be submerged by the high rising sea level if nothing is done. So even Tuvalu has thought about a digital clone just in case their territory, islands, are fully submerged by the ocean. Why do I tell you this? Indonesia is also island countries. We're also as prone to climate crisis as these countries. We've seen cities sinking. Think about it. If we want to be a developed country, but the climate crisis poses an existential threat, we can never be a developed country by 2045 if we go extinct before then. And that is why sustainable development must be woven into the way we think about our economy. We've been talking about some positive outlook. But let's add one more lever on how Indonesia can become a developed country by avoiding our extinction. And I add the fifth lever there, which is sustainable resource management and environmental resilience. What we've seen in the past few years is that annual CO2 emissions emitted by Indonesia has been going up. Today, it's about around 0.7 billion tons. This number is projected to grow almost more than double by 2030 if we don't do anything. Some people have been talking about internalizing environmental externalities into the way we think about our economy. But we understand that internalizing environmental externalities will be very, very expensive, even though it's needed. The good news is, just like all the bad news out there, the good news is we have the capital to do this. And I'll just talk about two today. Number one, we have the renewable energy capital. We have the potential. And the potential for renewable energy in Indonesia is at more than 3,000 gigawatt. And we've only utilized a fraction of it. Imagine if we untap all of these. The contribution of renewable energy into national energy mix in Indonesia is currently sits at 16%. Comparing it to countries like Brazil, they've managed to increase the contribution of renewable energy into the national energy mix at more than 70%. Imagine the things we can do if we increase this. Another capital that I want to talk about is the forest cover area in Indonesia. Indonesia has one of the largest forest cover area in the world. And according to government analysis, there's so much of carbon that we can sequester from our forest area. So those two are the capital that we have, the natural environmental capital that we have. But still, you might ask, how do we pay for the rest? It's still expensive. So let's talk about some of the options, the way we can pay for internalizing environmental externalities. Economists, policymakers have talked about some options. Let's talk about three today: carbon tax, green bonds, and public-private partnership, which some governments in the world, including the government of Indonesia, has done. Imagine the potential revenue that we can get from some of these options. And today, let's just focus on carbon tax. According to the government's analysis, the potential revenue from just one pocket, which is carbon tax, can reach up to 6.5 trillion Indonesian rupiah. Imagine if we use this pool of money to fund our project of internalizing environmental externalities. Now, we've been talking a lot about our GDP. We've been talking about economic measures. The way we think our GDP is mostly talking about consumption, trade, export, import, investment, etc., etc. The Comprehensive Wealth Index not only accounts for financial capital, but also accounts for things that we've discussed today: skills development, healthcare, talent retention, infrastructure, and even environmental resources and our efforts to conserve it. Indonesia is proud to be one of the 3 countries that became the case studies on how to calculate the Comprehensive Wealth Index during a meeting at the UN Summit of the Future back in September in New York this year. And that could be an alternative on the way we think about our economy. Now, before I conclude, I want to leave you all with this thought. Indonesia has every potential to become a developed country. The question is, are we ready? Thank you.